Europa en poemas.
Europa w wierszach.
Europa pjesmama.
Şiirlerle Avrupa.
Córdoba.
Warszawa.
İstanbul.
Zagreb.
Julia Fiedorczuk.
Gonca Özmen.
Tomica Bajsić.
Ben Clark.
Daytime drinking. First sip, gentle as a stream overreaching, supple as a rope bridge in the air. The second, long as the creak of floorboards, firm as a leg iron clasp. The third, sudden as the trapdoor beneath you, the rudderless slide back to thirst. This is one of hundreds of poems by hundreds of poets from all over Europe, from 49 countries altogether and 47 languages. In this particular case, it was a poem, a Welsh poem by Patrick McGuinness, a 6-line poem in English. One of a multitude of fantastic poetic voices. Welcome to a presentation of the anthology Grand Tour, Travels through the Young Poetry of Europe. Originally, we were planning to present this book in Gdansk in Poland, live. Unfortunately, we're forced now to do an online presentation, but Federico Italiano and myself, Jan Wagner, are looking forward to present 4 fantastic poets from this anthology to you.
This anthology was born some years ago, probably while Jan and I were drinking a glass of red wine after a reading, and we were talking about poets in our age, poets from our generation. In a few minutes, we had a list of at least 20 of them. 20 poets in our generation, roughly in our age, that we liked, read, and translated. So it was already there, something like a micro anthology. And it was a crazy thought, but a beautiful thought, which became true thanks the German Academy for Literature and Language, who could wonderfully support this project. Without the help of the Academy, this anthology would have not been possible. So now is the time to listen to our poets. Today would have been a reading in a real place in Danzig. We are now in somehow a digital, virtual space, but at least it is still a space of communication, and we are happy to have our reading for you in this way, in this context. Now is the time for the reading.
The reading should have been taking place in Gdansk, and now we have to had to withdraw and do this online. And so it goes without saying that we're going to start with the Polish poet. So Julia Fiedorczuk is going to be the first poet to read. She was born in Warsaw in 1975, and she's one of those rare creatures. Or Julia, I think you're one of those rare creatures who not only write poetry, but both prose and poetry. You have published a novel, you've published a series of short stories as well, or collections of short stories, and you write poetry, and you translate poetry as well, and not only poetry. So one of those authors which can make you really envious if you can do anything yourself but poetry. And you've studied, of course, you've been working at the university, you've been a translator of various American poets and expert of some various American poets. And of course, Julia Fiedorczuk has won several awards for her collections of poetry. I should mention also that there's a lovely English translation of Julia's work called Oxygen, or the whole collection Oxygen has been published in the English-speaking world. So let's start with a little conversation just to get started before you're reading. I mentioned that you write both poetry and prose. And I heard once from the Swedish poet Lars Gustafsson that he uses poetry to sort of get heated up for the long distance, the novel. And while writing the novel, on the contrary, he's using little pieces falling from the novel, little motives to continue writing with poetry, which for me seems like the ideal way of writing, which I cannot do because I can't write novels. How do you do that? Or why do you do both? And how does it interact, poetry and prose?
Yeah, well, it's not easy to talk about these things because a lot of things happen very intuitively in the writing, and I think there's just different things that I need to say, and sometimes it seems like a longer narrative is what is required, and a longer narrative allows you to tell a larger story with that involves time, that involves time in a different way from poetry, because poetry, at least the way that I write, focuses very much on the moment, and so I think that it has a very different temporality. So sometimes I need this kind of temporality that is offered by a poem, which is I think I'm maybe quite influenced by imagism and that tradition of American modernist writing, which focuses precisely on the image, on the moment. And sometimes I need a kind of temporality to tell a story or to tell many interconnected stories, which is what I like to do in fiction. And so I need the kind of temporality that is offered by a narrative. But I also like to experiment within each sort of form of writing. So I like to think about each book as a slightly different adventure or a slightly different endeavor.
Ezra Pound, the founder of Imagism, famously said, it's better to write one image in your life than a whole novel. But you mentioned the American tradition, and I mentioned the great Polish tradition. You yourself have won the Szymborska Award and have been compared to your great predecessors. And there are all those great Polish poets like Miłosz, Herbert coming to mind if we talk about Polish poetry. And of course, you are influenced by your own tradition, but at the same time, you have been translating American poetry. I know that you've translated John Ashbery's essays. I think Ashbery in general is or has been a major influence on younger Polish poetry, if I'm informed correctly. Ashbery is an important figure in Polish poetry. But for yourself, apart from Imagism, there's another poet you've been working with or translating even extensively, Laura Riding. Could you say something about her influence on your work, or American poetry?
Yeah. Laura Riding is this really unique figure in American and transatlantic modernism, because she was so strict and so disciplined in her attitude towards language. She actually thought that the problems that people were facing, she was saying this right before the outbreak of the Second World War, and she was Jewish. She came from a Jewish family. And so she said that the fundamental reason why the world is basically going to pieces is because people are using language in a wrong way. That it's in the first place it's the question of how we use language. And even though when I studied her work, some years ago, when I looked at it closely, there was a lot of it sounded quite crazy. Like she wanted to create this sort of poetic utopia where people would actually sign a contract that they would use language in a very careful way, in a very precise way. That was the project. She had this project before, like around 1938. She came up with this project of this utopian community of people who agree to use language with precision. So it is crazy on the one hand, but on the other hand, when we think about our times right now, and when we consider the quality of language in politics, for instance, or in very often in the mass media or in social media, maybe it's not so crazy after all, the intuition that language has this really great power to destroy, but also to create peace. And so I was very much interested in writing because of these sort of utopian modernist grand projects that she had. And she thought for a period of time in her life that poetry could be that language, that it could be that language that helps us make peace, that helps us understand who we are. Her poetry is also generally her project is very spiritual. She asks this fundamental question regarding human identity on this planet. Who are we? Who is this I that thinks and sees and speaks? So she thought for a while that poetry could be the language, could be that language that helps us out of crisis. But then she gave up poetry, and she quit writing poetry, and she stopped. She fell silent. And that gesture of almost complete silence that she kept up for many years before coming back with essays and theoretical writings on language, it's also interesting. That gesture of silence, I also find it interesting. A kind of impossibility, or a kind of failure, in fact, that is an aspect of this utopian project. I've been thinking about utopias quite a lot lately, writing my last novel, because I think we need utopian thinking once again.
And it seems to me that such a thing, like the contract writing was suggesting, seems to be worth considering in these times.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes.
There's one poem you've written dedicated to Laura riding. It's a sestina called The Snow Queen. And it's a lovely poem. We should or could talk about this very strange and very strict form of the sestina for a much longer time, but I would ask you now to read your poems for us.
Okay. So I'll read in Polish, and the first poem is titled Orion's Shoulder, and it's a name of our part of the Milky Way, simply it's our address in kosmos. Ramię Oriona. Wielkie poruszenie na tych gładkich morzach, kłębią się ciężkie, ciemne ciała ryb. To duch awaryjnie ląduje na wodzie, ślizga się, tnie toń, wytraca prędkość, czas. Czas rozdzielić poły słonecznego płaszcza, uwolnić wiatr i już. Pył międzygwiazdowy na listkach pierwszych drzew, rozmodlony zając strząsa słoną rosę, lgnie do ciepłej ziemi wsłuchany w jej musujące tętno. Asymilacja i dysymilacja, CO2, H2O i światło, światło, światło, przemiana materii w materię, wzrost i dojrzewanie w płaskim dysku falującej galaktyki. Czarna śmierć pulsuje cicho pomiędzy gwiazdami, koło biegunu krąży wiecznymi obwody, płomienna Belteges, Rigel, Bellatrix, jadą kosiarze na jesienne niebo. Patrz, patrzymy. Masz we włosach mgłę i nitki pajęczyny, niesiesz reklamówkę pełną zimnych gruszek. And the other poem is called Oxygen. I like to say that oxygen is the most sociable element in the universe because it never exists on its own. Like the oxygen particle never exists on its own. It's always at least O2, or it easily binds with other particles. And there was a moment when I thought of my own writing as a kind of oxygen poetics, because I also like to make connections across languages, across contexts, and so here it comes. Tlen. Pokażę Ci miłość w jednej garści gwiazd. Znasz feerię śniegu na przydrożnych liściach, fioletowy kontur grudniowego dnia. Przyszłam tu, żeby oddychać. Są mali tancerze w kropli rzecznej wody, raje owadów za bramą ogrodu, gniazdo w zgięciu ramion tamtej grubej sosny, w gnieździe moich ramion mleczny oddech dziecka. Lekko mieszkamy na wydechu świata, jeden mrok dodany do drugiego mroku, usta przy policzku, policzek przy udzie. Lekko mieszkamy na wydechu świata, ciepła sierść wilczycy i jej ostre zęby, brzytwa mrozu gładzi ciemną skórę rzeki, jej mieszkańcy bezszelestnie opadają na dno. Przyszłam tu, żeby oddychać. Smutek naszych rzeczy na zimowym niebie, śnieg szybko topnieje na policzkach dziecka, nasze oczy śmieją się do gwiazd, niebo spotyka gładką skórę rzeki, oddycham, więc jestem.
Well, thank you very much for reading the poems. I'm starting only now because I was hoping for the sestina for Laura writing, but that's too long a poem. And thank you for taking the time to read.
Thank you so much.
I hope sincerely we can repeat all this in a live situation.
Oh, I'd love to. It would be lovely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
So our next poet is Ben Clark. We are very happy to have you here, Ben.
Hi.
Hi.
Nice to be here.
Very happy to have you here, Ben. Ben is a Spanish poet, although his name is a sound British name. He has British parents. He started to write poetry very young. If I'm not wrong, Ben, you started when you were 17 years old. And you started writing and publishing when you were 17 years old. And now you are 36 and you're already one of the most discussed and read poets of the young generations.
Well, I think I definitely feel like I've been writing for quite a while, even though I like to think that I'm still young. In fact, I started writing as a teenager, and I published my first book in 2001. So next year it'll be 20 years, which seems pretty crazy. Although there was a little bit of a gap between this first book in 2001 and the book that was, well, a little bit well known in Spain, which was in 2006 with an award called the Hyperion Prize.
Yes, exactly. And you have other poetry collections which already won various and important awards. The last one, for example, for your book La Policía Celeste, the Celestial Police, if I may translate it this way, or how would you translate it? Celestial Police?
Well, it could be the Sky Police, and in fact, the term comes from a German word, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the Himmelspolizei. So it's the Sky Police. In Spain, there was a translation by a journalist, which is a very beautiful translation, which I used for the title, La Policía Celeste. So it means the police of the celestial, the police of the sky, but it could also mean celeste as a color. So it's a very light blue, the color of the sky at daytime.
Yes, I remember we were talking about this title of your poetry collection when we met in Germany. It was a very interesting history. And for this book, you won the Loewe Poetry Prize in 2017. Anyway,
yes,
please.
No, this is a very well-known prize in Spain because it has the sponsorship of a very important brand, Loewe, which is a brand of fashion, and for about 30 years now they've been supporting a poetry prize. And because it has a very strong, it's a very large prize economically, but it also has a lot of publicity. It's become one of the most well-known prizes in Spanish language. In fact, it has a very large presence in South America as well. And also the prize comes with an extra prize, which is published in the most well-known collection in Spain, which is called Visor. And it's very well read, and I'm very, very happy to have had the chance to reach many, many readers through this wonderful award.
Yes, congratulations. And apropos of readers, you already had in 2011 something like a viral poem.
Yes.
One of your best known poems, probably. I translated into English the title, The Ultimate End of Bad Literature, which went viral in 2011,
yes,
reaching a widespread on social media. And something else, exactly in this kind of context of social media, and during the COVID pandemic, during this social distancing imposed by the COVID pandemic, you launched the so-called Corona verses, verses of Corona, if I'm not wrong, and on Twitter, and which quickly generated a huge impact in the social network, giving rise to a whole international initiative to spread poetry in face of isolation. And thinking about it, this is my first question for you. Could we put together these two terms, poetry and virus? Could be poetry viral in a positive sense?
Well, I think it's very hard for us today to try and find a positive sense to the word viral. But if we think of the way the word is used in the internet as something that can spread as information, often we think of maybe a silly video or a meme or some kind of tweet. But I think there is a positive sense also in the idea, as you're saying, of having a poem go viral, no? With the phenomenon with my viral poem, it sort of spent roughly about 10 years traveling through internet and basically hasn't stopped and has reached, well, definitely over 1 million readers. So this is wonderful for me, independently of the quality of the poem, for in fact, I don't think it's a great poem, but just the idea of 1 million people reading something that I thought up at some moment, maybe in complete solitude, is very crazy. So maybe we can talk of an idea with poetry, which especially with short poems, maybe even with just lines, maybe 2-3 line poems, the possibility of them traveling and actually breaking through the barrier of the page and breaking through the barrier of, well, definitely of countries and different languages even. So I like to think that there is a positive side to the viral phenomenon. And with the coronavirus in Spanish, this was my idea, to try and infect the world with poetry.
Yes, nice. And you have a new book of poems, something like a collected poems, or no, more like selected poetry. ¿Y por qué no lo hacemos en el suelo? ¿No? Something like, and why don't we do it on the ground?
Yes, or on the floor. This is the title is from the Beatles song of Why Don't We Do It on the Road?
Why don't we do it on the floor? Exactly.
It's a great song. So this is just a play on that game, on that title. Instead of being the road, it's Why Don't We Do It on the Floor? And it's a kind of suggestion to start something, not necessarily sexual, but maybe a story, some kind of, some kind of relationship, some kind of event that will happen on the bottom floor, on the bottom level, right at the lowest point which is the floor.
Yes, in this book you're bringing together many poems of yours you have written in the last 15 years and also recent poems. But all these poems have in common the theme. They all speak somehow about love. Am I right?
Yes, this is correct. It's kind of an anthology, except I don't really like to use this word because the idea is more of creating a new book, but with one theme, which is a theme of love poems, and also new poems that I've incorporated into this book that all reflect on the idea of love. Many of my poems always try and work from the daily experiences, very small events. In this sense, I like to think of maybe influences like the North American poet Raymond Carver, as in the sense of taking something very ordinary, very normal, and trying to transform it into something a bit more universal and maybe something that could be interesting for somebody who is completely aside from your personal experience. So in that sense, I'm interested in love stories which are very personal, very unique, but that can somehow transmit a sensation, and that you can create empathy with the reader, so that even though this is a personal story, you might be interested on the other side as well.
Thank you very much. And the last point, we were talking about Europe as a space of translation. You are a Spanish poet with an important, very important English background. You also translate English poetry into Spanish. How would you describe the role of translation for your work and in general for poetry?
Well, I think if anybody has the chance to translate, I think they should, because it's definitely, in my opinion, it's the best school for poetry. Not only to learn about poetry in general, but to really reflect on the target language. I think that when I translate primarily from English to Spanish, I discover things about Spanish that are really, really down to the depth of the language, the syntax, but not just the syntax, also the actual construction of the words, and even something as poetical and mysterious as the sounds of the words. So translating poetry has been for me one of the most enriching experiences and one of the most important experiences as a learning curve. And I think that I'll never stop translating poetry, because it's a way of connecting to another poet, connecting to a poet who's maybe disappeared many years ago, and that somehow there's a dialogue between you and between this person, and there's a very, very strong intimacy which happens between the text, but also between these two people that maybe will never meet. So when I spend time without creating new poems, I always go back to translation as a way of satisfying this sort of need to keep writing.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for this wonderful insights, for this passionate discussion about poetry and translation and love. Now it's time to hear your poems. Please, let's listen to Ben Clark's poems.
Well, thank you very much. This first poem is called Cubierto, and like I said before, as many of my poems, it's really almost a short story of a little boy who lies down in one of these rubber dinghies, one of these little plastic boats, and because he is lying down, his mother can't see him, so she's worried. This is kind of the summary of this poem. Cubierto. Ordenando sin asco las cucharas de un restaurante caro, recordé las olas y a mi madre. Había varios tipos de cucharas, postre con leche y solo. Y no era raro que apareciera un huérfano, un pobre desterrado de quién sabe qué franquicia, qué bar, qué casa sola. Estas piezas bastardas acababan todas juntas en un tupperware blanco, y eran muchas y distintas. Ordenando y puliendo las cucharas en los últimos días del verano, pensé en mi madre blanca con los ojos recorriendo las olas en busca del pequeño que no sabe que está tumbado dentro del barco inflable azul. Pensé en el mar, en sus corrientes raras, en los sitios que visitó mi madre en su cabeza, los cajones oscuros de la mente. Pero me incorporé y gritó y la cosa quedó en algo que padre no sabría. Un objeto pequeño que, empujado por quién sabe qué miedos, reapareció de pronto en los últimos días del verano. This next poem is a poem about an event which was predicted would happen a few years back on the 21st of December of 2012. This was the end of the world, according to of course, a misinterpretation we know now of the Mayan calendar. It is a poem about what I would do if the world was to end today, and my idea was just to do what we always do. ¿No? Si llega el fin del mundo. Si llega el fin del mundo y tú te has ido al gym, porque hoy es viernes y has dicho que no importa, que a ti nada te va a impedir correr 7 kilómetros antes de que reviente el universo. Si llega el fin del mundo y me sorprende aquí, en el escritorio, pensando en ti corriendo hacia el final de los tiempos, quiero dejar escrito aquí y ahora que me parece bien, que no concibo un final más espléndido y más puro. Los atascos de un viernes por la tarde, los compromisos rotos de otro sábado, todas las cosas breves empujadas de pronto hacia una huida, y mientras tanto tú, corriendo y preguntándote si iré a buscarte después, y mientras tanto yo, pensando en recogerte a la salida, duchada y expectante, para irnos a cenar como si no importara, a ese bar de las tapas al que vamos los viernes cuando sales del gimnasio.
Thank you very much, Ben, for being here with us, for sharing with us your poems. Now we are here in this virtual space of communication. I hope very much that we can see each other again very soon in real life and hear your poems in such a digital distance.
Yes. Well, I want to say thank you very much, and also that even though this is maybe a distant reading, I feel that we are very close, and that the people who are listening and seeing these poems are definitely close to me and close to my thoughts. And I just hope everybody is well, everybody is fine, and please stay safe, and viva la poesía.
Viva la poesía. Thank you very much, Ben. Bye.
Well, the next poet to read for us on screen, and unfortunately not live and in person in Gdansk, is Tomica Bajsic from Zagreb. And it's a pleasure, Tomica, to have you with us, to see you, even if it's just on a screen. But it's beautiful to see you in your apartment. I will briefly introduce you and talk about you, and then we can have a brief conversation as well. It's difficult to imagine a poet like Tomica Bajsic, who's both very present and formidable as a poet, and with his poetry, and at the same time busy promoting poetry on a grand scale. It almost gives you the feeling that there must be at least 2 or 3 Tomislav Bajsics around somewhere, because he's doing so much. He's writing poetry, he's translating poetry and editing poetry. He's the founder of Poesia, a magazine dedicated to poetry in translation and to poetry in general, as the title suggests, of course. He's the Croatian director of Lyricline, that lovely online portal for poetry and poetry readings and translation. He's also involved in the Zagreb Poetry Festival, and he's been serving as the as the president of the Croatian Pen Center for many years. So both in poetry and in doing what is necessary to make people read poetry, Tomislav is very engaged and very prolific. He was born in Zagreb in 1968. He's still living in Zagreb, and he's like Julia Fidolczuk, also writing both poetry and prose. He's published some collections of prose and several collections of poetry, which have been translated into numerous languages. He's also editor of anthologies. I should mention that he's translated Blaise Cendrale, the works of Blaise Cendrale, and others. And there's an anthology he edited and translated as well, an anthology whose title I do not have with me at the moment, but the theme is war in world poetry. It's an anthology dedicated, amongst other things, to war poetry. Tomislav, when people talk about war poetry in Germany, they might think of the great classics. They might think of English war poets like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon. And many may be surprised to see that right now in Europe, there is a strong thematic strain of war poems. Let's briefly talk about that subject matter, because you were 22, 23 when what was known as Yugoslavia came to fall apart, and when conflict was happening and tragedy began. Is it true that you started to write poetry, or that you started to focus on writing poetry when the war happened?
Hello, Jan, and nice to be with you here, and congratulations for this marvelous book, the Grand Tour of Poetry. The poetry is moving, poetry is alive, and that's something that Europe needs now. This European spirit through poetry. So that's like I will just say that what you said in the beginning. I was an editor in Poesia magazine for 12 years, one of the founders. But I also have this publishing house that I publish poetry and so on. It is a small pocket poetry books, but we go on and try to bring some of the best world poetry to Croatia, to this publishing that I have started like in 2010. What you have said now, it is true that I have participated in the Croatian War for Independence. For 5 years, I was a student when the war started. We were under aggression, and then people went out from the universities to start to demonstrate against the war, and we had to defend our cities, our villages, and then I have started to write at the end of the war. After the war, I have started to write poetry, because I thought, as a student of arts, I was an artist, more with lithography and graphics, and I saw that through poetry I may express best what I have witnessed through these chaotic times that were during these 5 years of the war in Croatia. So that's how I switched a little bit. Although I work in graphic design and everything, but I have switched to poetry in that period, but it was after the war. So like that I started, and then I think that is something that I found, and the poets that you mentioned, and of course including every country has it, and Georg Trakl, it comes to my mind, and all the Hungarian poets, all Polish and everybody. So like that's something to this poetry, to the war, through the poetry, I have tried to found the sense of being in an apocalypse, what the war is. So like there is through the poetry, I try to see how to express myself as an artist.
Yeah. Well, the English poet Winston Hugh Auden famously said that poetry makes nothing happen. I mentioned that you have been, for many years, been busy as the director of the Croatian Pen Center. So clearly, that's not something you would subscribe to, is it? I mean, you would just probably argue that poetry is something which can make things happen. And I'm wondering whether in Croatia, also due to the history of the 90s, poetry may be something which has a greater influence in society as in other countries like Germany, for example. Is that true? Or is there something which people in Croatia find in poetry or seek for in poetry? And is there a sort of communicative effect that poetry has in Croatia, even today?
I don't know how it is today. But then after the war, like in 95, then I published my first poetry book, Southern Cross, and it was like it was received as a first anti-war book by someone who was actually a warrior who fought in the war, and so it was something that has some impact, and I have received the prize for the younger poets. And so on. Maybe during those times it had an impact, but also now things changed. But everywhere in the world, such crises happen, such fields happen. So we have now everywhere, like we have, like Hong Kong, you have Syria, you have everywhere. So like it is something that goes on. And then this anthology that I have published, that is called World Anthology of Poetry about the war, repression, and slavery. It shows that it's from the ancient Greece to nowadays India and nowadays China, that same things happen, but on different locations with different people. So like it is something that is universal, and the people who feel it like a burden to pass through all this malice that is the war for the society in general, to everybody, especially for the families of the victims of the war. So like it showed that this burden is something that happens. It could be shared in a way. So that happened before, and it happens all around. So it is not just for you to bear it and so on. That I think that had some. It was also well received in Bosnia and so on. So it had something. This anthology had something to see that yes, of course, that what happened like in ancient Greece happened to me now, or something like this, or India today, and so on. So that was my idea that I published this. So that is, but the impact of poetry, what you said, like the pen is, we are always, a voice on the margins, but sometimes it's something that helps the person to find the book and the bookshelves or something, and said, okay, now I see what I think about it, what I thought about it. I feel better that I have somebody to talk with, because the poetry is a dialogue. It is not the monologue, for example, like the novel, but it is a dialogue. It needs a reader. Poem ends with the reader reading it, and so on, and participating in that poem.
Yeah. Well, you just showed us this lovely book you published, and obviously you're very busy promoting world poetry in Croatia. Federico and I talked briefly about the importance of exchanging ideas and exchanging things across the borders of language and across national borders, and your way of publishing books and translating is obviously part of that process of having a dialogue, amongst traditions of several cultures, several countries. we state in the preface that that is something that is happening in the young poetry in Europe all the time at the moment. There's a sort of permanent transfer in poetry, it seems, and that must be the same in Croatia. Influences from Blaise Cendrars, from American poetry, but also from all the countries of Europe. You mentioned Georg Trakl and so on. Vasco Popa is popular in all of Europe, and so on and so on. But I was wondering, the countries of ex-Yugoslavia, is there still among the younger poets a stronger way of communicating? What about for example, at the festival in Zagreb or festivals in Belgrade, is there a stronger link and a permanent discourse going on between poets from Croatia, poets from Bosnia, and so on? Is there still sort of a community of poets, or a shared poetic universe? Because, of course, you can understand each other's poems without any problem.
Yes, so that's what the idea of PEN is, that literature knows no borders, and that we have to preserve this kind of dialogue between nations through our literature, through the best what we have, and of course through the poetry. So and then of course to find a way to cross the borders that are not physical, that are not borders between countries, but borders between people, minds, or something like this. That's what you mentioned, Blaise Cendrars twice. So that Blaise Cendrars was also, for example, in the war in France and so on during the Second World War. But he was such a positive person that he just swam through it, and then he gave wonderful poetry later, and also that I thought that it is the way that we can confront the worst things that happens through the positive thinking, through the friendship, and through something that we all love and cherish, that we all think what life is worth for. So that's in former Yugoslavia, of course, through poetry. There is, I mean, even during the war, the culture was functioning, collaborating, the people, the writers, of course, the writers are writers. So like it's the poet, and your roots are the poetry and literature. So that never stopped. There are problems between sharing the books because of the borders and everything. It's hard to to know what is now new in Belgrade or in Sarajevo and so on. So it is more difficult, but through poetry, that poetry goes online and everything, so you can share, and of course the poetry festivals, that you can share and see what other people are writing. And so everyone, there is a strong movement of young poets that are surpassing, of course, the borders, and then and it is shareable, and it is visible. And of course, lyric line, you mentioned lyric line, then Versopolis and so on, and of course, and your anthology Grand Tour.
Oh, thanks. Well, thank you for taking the time to answer these three questions and talk about sharing. Now, I would ask you, Tomica, to share some poets in Croatian with us.
As I understood, there are two poems to read. Yes, okay. It is that first I will read 27th day. It is to my daughter Mara on the 27th day of her birth. 27. dan. Svjetlost i sjena razdvajaju se, a do prije 27 dana bili su jedno. Tvoje crne kose oči sada traže rubove. Rođena ovaj svijet s ničim od opreme. Toliko si mala da ne poznaješ ni svoje ime. Želiš nas osvojiti tim osmijehom novostvorenoga neba. Kakav je to osmijeh? Sve pčele Alpa i sve šumske vatre Mongolije i svih 350 crkvenih tornjeva Salvadora i svi planktoni Atlantika nalaze utočište u nebu tvoga osmijeha, iskovanog na tajnom mjestu koje je poznato samo pojedinim levitirajućim svecima. Gledaš uokolo i svemu se čudiš, ali moram ti reći da u tvojim crnim očima, starim 10.000 godina, još uvijek mogu vidjeti odraz onog tihog jezera čija dubina se ne može izmjeriti. Meni je to tiho jezero nepoznato sjećanje. Znanstvenici ga zovu crnom rupom prostora, a neki ga jednostavno zovu vrećom od ugljena. Religiozni ljudi, oni to jezero zovu duh. Na tom su tihom jezeru tvoje crne oči još donedavno bile dva indijanska kanua koja bezbrižno veslaju beskrajan svemira. So it is from my book Songs of Light and Shadow, and this is the other one, the short one. It's a love poem dedicated to my wife Ivana. It's from the first book, The Southern Cross, that received that Ivan Goranković prize. Veslo je prošlo kroz vodu u kovitu crnih ledenih iglica. Ušao sam u sobu i našao te kako spavaš, tako nepomična da mi se činilo kao da si mrtva. Da živimo i 200 godina, uvijek bi ostalo stvari koje nismo stekli reći jedno drugima. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Tumica, for sharing the poetry with us. And I hope we can repeat that soon in some real place. But that was lovely. Thank you so much.
Yes, it would be refreshing. It would be refreshing to see each other, all of us, in the real life. Yes, I hope it will be soon. So, thank you very much for everything.
Our next poet is Gonca Osman. We are all very happy to have you here, Gonca.
Hello, thank you a lot. I'm very happy as well.
Gonca is one of the most important and original Turkish poets of her generation. Your poetry, Gonca, explores both nature and urban life. Istanbul's cityscapes, its light, its shadows, its backyards are integral part of your metaphorical fund. As a Turkish poet, Efe Duyan, who is another poet in our anthology, writes about your poetry. He says, your poetry offers, I quote, an exciting and challenging hybrid, conceptual complexity and the sound of folk music, using rhythmic elements extensively and sticking to clear structural forms. She manages to create a critical approach towards any subject she deals with. This is a wonderful description of your poetry, and everybody who reads it would like to know more about your work. You were born in Burdur, and you study English literature. You hold a PhD, a doctorate in English literature. You have written a thesis about ekphrasis, the ekphrastic poetry of Cubist male painters. You have published 3 collections of poetry. You have been awarded various prizes, and you have been serving as editor of different literary magazines, in particular a journal on translation, on literary translation. So my first question for you, Gonca, thinking about your interest in the arts, is there for you a particular interest in the relationship between poetry and the arts? I ask that because you are not the only one in our anthology. There are also other poets I can remember, for example, Maria Barnas from Holland, which are very much interested in the arts, in painting, installation, and so on. So it's very interesting now for me and for our audience, which is your perspective on this, on the relationship between poetry and the arts.
Thank you, Federico, for all the words. I want to say that I'm very happy and honored to be part of this very huge, rich and inspiring anthology. It is wonderful to be with my friends there. And another part is that I'm very happy to meet new friends as well. Thanks to your anthology. I'm learning a lot and I really love this collaboration. And for me, the collaboration of poets between their works are very similar to the collaboration between poetry and other artists. It is not only painting, but also music, dancing, theater, cinema, and all the other art forms. I think they are sisters and brothers. And the dialogue between them really enrich our own art as well. So Efe puts, my very close friend, as you know, Efe puts great effort in these wonderful sentences, comments on my poetry. I think it's easier to hear someone else who is commenting on your poetry, because talking, really trying to explore your own poetry can be so challenging for me. I don't know, do you agree?
Well, somehow I do agree, but
because it is easier to hear people, and the connection between nature and the city life is also coming from my biography as well, because till 18-year-old, I was born in a very small city, and I was within nature, and my childhood was directly in the nature. So afterwards, I came to Istanbul. It was when I was 18, I was here for my university education, and I miss being within nature a lot in this huge city. And contrarily, sometimes within nature, I miss the horrible sounds of the city as well.
Yeah.
So in my poetry, I think all these different things are in a dialogue to create, some alternative maybe sounds or alternative lines, metaphors, because I'm coming from oral tradition. My grandmother, when I was so small, when I was a child, 4 or 5-year-old, she was an illiterate woman, but still she told me fairy tales. She told me, some small rhymes. Just she has a kind of creative mind, and I was so impressed with her.
Apropos of your family, there are a lot of poems in our anthology dealing with the mother figure, and you are one of these poets present in the anthology with a wonderful poem about your mother, which I would now roughly translate into English, something like "Because my mother." Is it something that for you also could explain somehow your relationship to poetry, your relation with the family, the mother, the tradition, which is symbolically contained in this figure? Would you agree with it?
Yes, but before maybe I can add some more about arts, because especially when I came to Istanbul, I started going art museums, and I started learning more about arts. And always there is I find many inspirations from lots of paintings, especially paintings, nude paintings, because I'm working on body politics as well.
Yeah.
Especially the female body, how female body is represented within art, within literature, and of course within poetry. And this urge, of course, at the same time corresponds to my relationship with my own mother. But not only this relationship or my relationship with my own daughter, because I'm a mother as well, a newly mother, 10 years mother. But at the same time, this is a kind of dialogue with my mothers from literary tradition, with my mothers from art tradition. In that sense, there is a kind of course, feminist understanding within my lines, especially where I'm talking about the female body and the change in that body. And, you know, in my culture, still, the body of the female is still a horrible, can be a horrible or frightening thing. Then the authorities demand that you need to censor the wishes of your body, even your physical body. You have to cover your physical body in this conservative tradition. So if you think, you know, the religion of the country and the traditional understanding of the sexuality of the female, especially, not of the male, but the female. It's always a problem. So still, we are still we have to make lots of things. We have to write more. We have to react more. We have to demand more for the freedom of the female bodies, of the freedom of the mothers, of the freedom of the daughters, of the freedom of, you know, the women in this country. So I feel that I am responsible for my sisters as well as for my mothers.
Well, thank you very much, Gonca, for this wonderful and passionate discussion we are having, and I would like to hear a lot more of your experience, of your ideas on poetry and on culture and on relationships. But we now have to start listening to your own poems. So now I'm happy if you would read us a couple of poems of yours.
Of course, with pleasure. Thank you. Thank you a lot. Bakraç. Herkeslerin uzağı vardı, ben çok çağırdım. Benden önce bir kadını vardı herkeslerin. İnattım, hoyrattım, sallanan bir bakraçtım. Herkeslerin neşesinde ben hep sakardım. Bendeki rüzgarla açılanlar, göğün aklından sarkanlar. Sizden ne alacaktım? Bıraktım. Deyin ki ağaç kovuklarında dolandım. Her çalılıkta yazgımı biraz kararttım. İnandığınız o hayrete ne yapsam varamadım. Herkesler tamdı. Bir ben olmadım. Bir çocuk düşerkenki gibi baktım. Dünya çok alçak bir yer. İndim. Uçmadım. Dutluk. Dutluğa doğru gel, evlerin uzağına. Sana susmayı öğreteceğim, dalların kaygısını da. Azaldığın yerden öpeceğim, azaldığı yerden doğanın. Ovayı geç, dutluğa doğru gel, arasına otların. Sana fırtınayı dinleteceğim, teşubun çığlığını. Bir suyun ardında seni neden sonra yine bekleyeceğim. Tarlayı geç, daha gel daha, dut kokusuna. Sana karıncaları göstereceğim.
Thank you very much, Gonca, for your poems, for sharing with us your poems, and for being here with us in this virtual space, in this virtual space of communication, of interaction. But we very much hope to see each other very soon again in the real life. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. I believe that our communication within pages now in this online platform. So we will always be together in order to create a better, a peaceful world, which will be bridges for each other's voices. Thank you a lot. You give lots of things to my poetry, to my voice, to my world as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonca. Bye.
Bye.